Do they need assistance?
Do they need assistance?
¿Necesitan ayuda?
Do they need assistance? How do you feel?
How do you feel?
¿Cómo te sientes?
How do you feel? Do I make sense?
Do I make sense?
¿Tiene sentido lo que digo?
Do I make sense? I do my best.
I do my best.
Hago mi mejor esfuerzo.
I do my best. What do you see?
What do you see?
¿Qué ves?
What do you see? Do you cook often?
Do you cook often?
¿Cocinas a menudo?
Do you cook often? Where do we meet?
Where do we meet?
¿Dónde nos encontramos?
Where do we meet? Do they support this?
Do they support this?
¿Apoyan esto?
Do they support this? Do you want coffee?
Do you want coffee?
¿Quieres café?
Do you want coffee? What do you suggest?
What do you suggest?
¿Qué sugieres?
What do you suggest? Do I need this?
Do I need this?
¿Necesito esto?
Do I need this? When do you leave?
When do you leave?
¿Cuándo te vas?
When do you leave? How do we start?
How do we start?
¿Cómo empezamos?
How do we start? Do you remember me?
Do you remember me?
¿Me recuerdas?
Do you remember me? What do you expect?
What do you expect?
¿Qué esperas?
What do you expect? Do we have enough?
Do we have enough?
¿Tenemos suficiente?
Do we have enough? Do they like it?
Do they like it?
¿Les gusta?
Do they like it? Do you drive here?
Do you drive here?
¿Manejaste hasta aquí?
Do you drive here? Where do you work?
Where do you work?
¿Dónde trabajas?
Where do you work? I do care deeply.
I do care deeply.
Me importa mucho.
I do care deeply. What do you do?
What do you do?
¿Qué haces?
What do you do? Do we have questions?
Do we have questions?
¿Tenemos preguntas?
Do we have questions? Do you feel safe?
Do you feel safe?
¿Te sientes seguro?
Do you feel safe? How do I know?
How do I know?
¿Cómo lo sé?
How do I know? Would you do it?
Would you do it?
¿Lo harías?
Would you do it? Do they understand everything?
Do they understand everything?
¿Entienden todo?
Do they understand everything? Do you want to dance?
Do you want to dance?
¿Quieres bailar?
Do you want to dance? What do we do?
What do we do?
¿Qué hacemos?
What do we do? Do you understand me?
Do you understand me?
¿Me entiendes?
Do you understand me? What do you need?
What do you need?
¿Qué necesitas?
What do you need? Do they agree with?
Do they agree with?
¿Están de acuerdo?
Do they agree with? Do you want to?
Do you want to?
¿Quieres?
Do you want to? What do you think?
What do you think?
¿Qué piensas?
What do you think? I do feel good.
I do feel good.
Me siento bien.
I do feel good. Do we have time?
Do we have time?
¿Tenemos tiempo?
Do we have time? Do you know how?
Do you know how?
¿Sabes cómo?
Do you know how? What do you like?
What do you like?
¿Qué te gusta?
What do you like? Do we need this?
Do we need this?
¿Necesitamos esto?
Do we need this? Do you play soccer?
Do you play soccer?
¿Juegas al fútbol?
Do you play soccer? Where do you live?
Where do you live?
¿Dónde vives?
Where do you live? How do you do?
How do you do?
¿Cómo estás?
How do you do? When do we start?
When do we start?
¿Cuándo empezamos?
When do we start? Do they believe this?
Do they believe this?
¿Creen en esto?
Do they believe this? Do you see that?
Do you see that?
¿Ves eso?
Do you see that? What do you prefer?
What do you prefer?
¿Qué prefieres?
What do you prefer? Do you enjoy this?
Do you enjoy this?
¿Disfrutas esto?
Do you enjoy this? I do appreciate it.
I do appreciate it.
Lo aprecio.
I do appreciate it. Do we know anyone?
Do we know anyone?
¿Conocemos a alguien?
Do we know anyone? How do I proceed?
How do I proceed?
¿Cómo procedo?
How do I proceed? Do you read books?
Do you read books?
¿Lees libros?
Do you read books? Do they have plans?
Do they have plans?
¿Tienen planes?
Do they have plans? What do you say?
What do you say?
¿Qué dices?
What do you say? Do we understand yet?
Do we understand yet?
¿Entendemos ya?
Do we understand yet? Where do we go?
Where do we go?
¿A dónde vamos?
Where do we go? Do you want help?
Do you want help?
¿Quieres ayuda?
Do you want help? When do we leave?
When do we leave?
¿Cuándo nos vamos?
When do we leave? How do you solve?
How do you solve?
¿Cómo lo resuelves?
How do you solve? Do you enjoy reading?
Do you enjoy reading?
¿Te gusta leer?
Do you enjoy reading? Where do you study?
Where do you study?
¿Dónde estudias?
Where do you study? Do I look good?
Do I look good?
¿Me veo bien?
Do I look good? What do you want?
What do you want?
¿Qué quieres?
What do you want? Do they play games?
Do they play games?
¿Juegan juegos?
Do they play games? How do we proceed?
How do we proceed?
¿Cómo seguimos?
How do we proceed? Do you remember that?
Do you remember that?
¿Recuerdas eso?
Do you remember that? What do they want?
What do they want?
¿Qué quieren?
What do they want? Do you always forget?
Do you always forget?
¿Siempre olvidas?
Do you always forget? Where do I sign?
Where do I sign?
¿Dónde firmo?
Where do I sign? How do things work?
How do things work?
¿Cómo funcionan las cosas?
How do things work? Do you travel often?
Do you travel often?
¿Viajas a menudo?
Do you travel often? Do we need anything?
Do we need anything?
¿Necesitamos algo?
Do we need anything? When do you arrive?
When do you arrive?
¿Cuándo llegas?
When do you arrive? Do I need help?
Do I need help?
¿Necesito ayuda?
Do I need help? Where do I begin?
Where do I begin?
¿Dónde empiezo?
Where do I begin? What do you prefer?
What do you prefer?
¿Qué prefieres?
What do you prefer? Do they sell food?
Do they sell food?
¿Venden comida?
Do they sell food? Do you want dessert?
Do you want dessert?
¿Quieres postre?
Do you want dessert? How do I contact?
How do I contact?
¿Cómo contacto?
How do I contact? Do you hear that?
Do you hear that?
¿Oyes eso?
Do you hear that? Do we want more?
Do we want more?
¿Queremos más?
Do we want more? What do you say?
What do you say?
¿Qué dices?
What do you say? When do you finish?
When do you finish?
¿Cuándo terminas?
When do you finish? Do you want to try?
Do you want to try?
¿Quieres probar?
Do you want to try? Where do I pay?
Where do I pay?
¿Dónde pago?
Where do I pay? How do we find?
How do we find?
¿Cómo encontramos?
How do we find? Do I have time?
Do I have time?
¿Tengo tiempo?
Do I have time? Do they finish early?
Do they finish early?
¿Terminan temprano?
Do they finish early? What do you recommend?
What do you recommend?
¿Qué recomiendas?
What do you recommend? Do you work here?
Do you work here?
¿Trabajas aquí?
Do you work here? Do you want more?
Do you want more?
¿Quieres más?
Do you want more? When do you go?
When do you go?
¿Cuándo vas?
When do you go? Where do I put?
Where do I put?
¿Dónde lo pongo?
Where do I put? What do I need?
What do I need?
¿Qué necesito?
What do I need? Do you have snacks?
Do you have snacks?
¿Tienes bocadillos?
Do you have snacks? How do I help?
How do I help?
¿Cómo ayudo?
How do I help? Do they care much?
Do they care much?
¿Les importa mucho?
Do they care much? Do you believe him?
Do you believe him?
¿Le crees?
Do you believe him? When do you call?
When do you call?
¿Cuándo llamas?
When do you call? What do you believe?
What do you believe?
¿Qué crees?
What do you believe? Do you buy groceries?
Do you buy groceries?
¿Compras comida?
Do you buy groceries? Do they like music?
Do they like music?
¿Les gusta la música?
Do they like music? Do you celebrate birthdays?
Do you celebrate birthdays?
¿Celebras cumpleaños?
Do you celebrate birthdays? When do we eat?
When do we eat?
¿Cuándo comemos?
When do we eat? How do I explain?
How do I explain?
¿Cómo explico?
How do I explain? Do you enjoy it?
Do you enjoy it?
¿Te gusta?
Do you enjoy it? Do you feel okay?
Do you feel okay?
¿Te sientes bien?
Do you feel okay? What do I say?
What do I say?
¿Qué digo?
What do I say? When do I arrive?
When do I arrive?
¿Cuándo llego?
When do I arrive? Do they visit often?
Do they visit often?
¿Nos visitan seguido?
Do they visit often? Do we ask questions?
Do we ask questions?
¿Hacemos preguntas?
Do we ask questions? How do I fix?
How do I fix?
¿Cómo arreglo esto?
How do I fix? What do I want?
What do I want?
¿Qué quiero?
What do I want? Where do we sit?
Where do we sit?
¿Dónde nos sentamos?
Where do we sit? Do you play piano?
Do you play piano?
¿Tocas el piano?
Do you play piano? When do you wake?
When do you wake?
¿Cuándo despiertas?
When do you wake? Do they write poems?
Do they write poems?
¿Escriben poemas?
Do they write poems? What do they do?
What do they do?
¿Qué hacen?
What do they do? How do I learn?
How do I learn?
¿Cómo aprendo?
How do I learn? Do we really know?
Do we really know?
¿Realmente sabemos?
Do we really know? Do you want pizza?
Do you want pizza?
¿Quieres pizza?
Do you want pizza? Do they go shopping?
Do they go shopping?
¿Van de compras?
Do they go shopping? When do you sleep?
When do you sleep?
¿Cuándo duermes?
When do you sleep? How do we contact?
How do we contact?
¿Cómo contactamos?
How do we contact? Do you have time?
Do you have time?
¿Tienes tiempo?
Do you have time? What do we eat?
What do we eat?
¿Qué comemos?
What do we eat? Do you know him?
Do you know him?
¿Lo conoces?
Do you know him? Where do you go?
Where do you go?
¿A dónde vas?
Where do you go? How do I do?
How do I do?
¿Cómo lo hago?
How do I do? Do we finish soon?
Do we finish soon?
¿Terminamos pronto?
Do we finish soon? What do you think?
What do you think?
¿Qué piensas?
What do you think? Do you swim well?
Do you swim well?
¿Nadas bien?
Do you swim well? Where do we travel?
Where do we travel?
¿A dónde viajamos?
Where do we travel? Do you listen closely?
Do you listen closely?
¿Escuchas con atención?
Do you listen closely? What do you see?
What do you see?
¿Qué ves?
What do you see? How do I reset?
How do I reset?
¿Cómo reinicio?
How do I reset? Do they understand now?
Do they understand now?
¿Entienden ahora?
Do they understand now? Do you like this?
Do you like this?
¿Te gusta esto?
Do you like this? What do they enjoy?
What do they enjoy?
¿Qué disfrutan?
What do they enjoy? How do we proceed?
How do we proceed?
¿Cómo seguimos?
How do we proceed? Do you watch movies?
Do you watch movies?
¿Ves películas?
Do you watch movies? When do you study?
When do you study?
¿Cuándo estudias?
When do you study? What do I choose?
What do I choose?
¿Qué elijo?
What do I choose? Do we save money?
Do we save money?
¿Ahorramos dinero?
Do we save money? How do they act?
How do they act?
¿Cómo actúan?
How do they act? Do you practice dance?
Do you practice dance?
¿Practicas baile?
Do you practice dance? Do they sell clothes?
Do they sell clothes?
¿Venden ropa?
Do they sell clothes? When do we start?
When do we start?
¿Cuándo empezamos?
When do we start? What do you suggest?
What do you suggest?
¿Qué sugieres?
What do you suggest? Do you feel tired?
Do you feel tired?
¿Te sientes cansado?
Do you feel tired? Do I inspire you?
Do I inspire you?
¿Te inspiro?
Do I inspire you? How do you know?
How do you know?
¿Cómo lo sabes?
How do you know? What do we discuss?
What do we discuss?
¿De qué hablamos?
What do we discuss? Do you believe in?
Do you believe in?
¿Crees en?
Do you believe in? When do we play?
When do we play?
¿Cuándo jugamos?
When do we play? Do they ask questions?
Do they ask questions?
¿Hacen preguntas?
Do they ask questions? Do you like traveling?
Do you like traveling?
¿Te gusta viajar?
Do you like traveling? What do you prefer?
What do you prefer?
¿Qué prefieres?
What do you prefer? Where do you want?
Where do you want?
¿Dónde quieres?
Where do you want? How do we celebrate?
How do we celebrate?
¿Cómo celebramos?
How do we celebrate? Do you visit often?
Do you visit often?
¿Nos visitas a menudo?
Do you visit often? Do they know why?
Do they know why?
¿Saben por qué?
Do they know why? When do you want?
When do you want?
¿Cuándo quieres?
When do you want? What do you find?
What do you find?
¿Qué encuentras?
What do you find? How do I process?
How do I process?
¿Cómo proceso esto?
How do I process? Do we really need?
Do we really need?
¿Realmente necesitamos esto?
Do we really need? Do you feel lucky?
Do you feel lucky?
¿Te sientes afortunado?
Do you feel lucky? What do we say?
What do we say?
¿Qué decimos?
What do we say? Do you play sports?
Do you play sports?
¿Juegas deportes?
Do you play sports? How do I behave?
How do I behave?
¿Cómo me comporto?
How do I behave? Do they really care?
Do they really care?
¿Realmente les importa?
Do they really care? What do you ask?
What do you ask?
¿Qué preguntas?
What do you ask? When do we leave?
When do we leave?
¿Cuándo nos vamos?
When do we leave? Where do I sit?
Where do I sit?
¿Dónde me siento?
Where do I sit? Do you know why?
Do you know why?
¿Sabes por qué?
Do you know why? How do you handle?
How do you handle?
¿Cómo lo manejas?
How do you handle? Do you remember this?
Do you remember this?
¿Recuerdas esto?
Do you remember this? What do I do?
What do I do?
¿Qué hago?
What do I do? Do they see it?
Do they see it?
¿Lo ven?
Do they see it? How do we improve?
How do we improve?
¿Cómo mejoramos?
How do we improve? Do you come here?
Do you come here?
¿Vienes aquí?
Do you come here? What do we say?
What do we say?
¿Qué decimos?
What do we say? Do you have questions?
Do you have questions?
¿Tienes preguntas?
Do you have questions? What do you choose?
What do you choose?
¿Qué eliges?
What do you choose? When do we plan?
When do we plan?
¿Cuándo planeamos?
When do we plan? How do I prepare?
How do I prepare?
¿Cómo me preparo?
How do I prepare? Do they really help?
Do they really help?
¿Realmente ayudan?
Do they really help? Where do you explore?
Where do you explore?
¿Dónde exploras?
Where do you explore? Do we discuss together?
Do we discuss together?
¿Discutimos juntos?
Do we discuss together? What do you say?
What do you say?
¿Qué dices?
What do you say? Do you see yourself?
Do you see yourself?
¿Te ves a ti mismo?
Do you see yourself? How do we relax?
How do we relax?
¿Cómo nos relajamos?
How do we relax? I do believe it.
I do believe it.
Lo creo.
I do believe it. What do I focus?
What do I focus?
¿En qué me enfoco?
What do I focus? Do you know truth?
Do you know truth?
¿Conoces la verdad?
Do you know truth? When do you leave?
When do you leave?
¿Cuándo te vas?
When do you leave? How do we achieve?
How do we achieve?
¿Cómo logramos esto?
How do we achieve? Do you feel it?
Do you feel it?
¿Lo sientes?
Do you feel it? What do they offer?
What do they offer?
¿Qué ofrecen?
What do they offer? Do you remember that?
Do you remember that?
¿Recuerdas eso?
Do you remember that? How do we celebrate?
How do we celebrate?
¿Cómo celebramos?
How do we celebrate? Do you fix things?
Do you fix things?
¿Arreglas cosas?
Do you fix things? When do you talk?
When do you talk?
¿Cuándo hablas?
When do you talk? Do we need to?
Do we need to?
¿Necesitamos hacerlo?
Do we need to? What do we bring?
What do we bring?
¿Qué llevamos?
What do we bring? How do we assist?
How do we assist?
¿Cómo ayudamos?
How do we assist? Do you adjust settings?
Do you adjust settings?
¿Ajustas configuraciones?
Do you adjust settings? Where do they go?
Where do they go?
¿A dónde van?
Where do they go? Do you want help?
Do you want help?
¿Quieres ayuda?
Do you want help? What do you create?
What do you create?
¿Qué creas?
What do you create? Do we stay here?
Do we stay here?
¿Nos quedamos aquí?
Do we stay here? How do I introduce?
How do I introduce?
¿Cómo me presento?
How do I introduce? What do we discuss?
What do we discuss?
¿De qué hablamos?
What do we discuss? Do you travel far?
Do you travel far?
¿Viajas lejos?
Do you travel far? When do you work?
When do you work?
¿Cuándo trabajas?
When do you work? What do you study?
What do you study?
¿Qué estudias?
What do you study? Do they play nice?
Do they play nice?
¿Juegan bien?
Do they play nice? Could you do it?
Could you do it?
¿Podrías hacerlo?
Could you do it? What do you hear?
What do you hear?
¿Qué oyes?
What do you hear? Where do we begin?
Where do we begin?
¿Dónde empezamos?
Where do we begin? How do they respond?
How do they respond?
¿Cómo responden?
How do they respond?